Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time. Bruce and I, as we were kind of watching all of the changes come in the immigration environment, and just through what's happening with COVID and the economic situation, like there's so much going on that is impacting all of you, and we thought that this would just be a really good time to talk about this topic of getting the career you want, navigating the immigration pieces, and just to do an update and respond to some questions. So thank you for giving us that opportunity. What we're going to cover, Bruce is going to start off and give you some great information about the career exploration process. I'm going to talk about employment-based immigration. Really, just this is designed to be a very high-level view. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the current U.S. immigration environment, and then wrap it up with some discussion of things that you can do to improve your chances of success, even in an environment like we're in today.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, this is actually the second time that we have done this presentation. We did it once last year because there are a lot of questions that we encounter, in particular in my role in the Career Development Office as I'm working with our international students and scholars about navigating not just their own careers, but the career and immigration process. And so I'm very thankful to partner with Michelle on this and provide some information around that. So what I'm going to do is just provide a very brief overview about how you think about your careers and what it is that you want to do. As Michelle mentioned, as we get into some of the immigration challenges potentially that may be present, we can bring that back together in the end to think about, in your specific situation, how do you actually make those plans to move yourself forward? One of the things that I find is always important to mention is that for a lot of folks, when they get into science, when you start working on your PhD, when you do a postdoc, oftentimes you're kind of focused on that tenure track position, and you haven't had a lot of opportunity to consider additional career options. And so it's always important to recognize that the skill set that you have is valuable in a lot of different areas, and you do have a lot of choice about how you want to apply that. There are positions within academia. There's the tenure track PI position, which may be where people are focused right now, but know that there are also other positions within academic environments, like being a staff scientist or running a core. There are a lot of opportunities that don't require having that independent investigator status as well. And so if you really like working in academia, there's more than just being a tenure track faculty member that's available to you. There are also positions in government and nonprofit, and government positions oftentimes allow you to do research that's very similar to academia, with the exception of changes in how you're funded. And so rather than having to fight for external, extramural funding, you have opportunities, you have more of a budget that you would have similar to a company, but the type of research that you do is very similar to the type of work you would do in academia. And then of course there's private industry and many, many other options. So we will send out the slides as well at the end of this, and there's a link in here to a website called PhD Career Guide that has a lot of really great information on different PhD career sectors. So in thinking about PhD careers, and when I work with students and postdocs, I often find that one of the barriers is that people feel stuck. They don't even know how to start this process, and they don't have a framework for how do I explore. That was my experience getting a PhD and going through the process. It was always frustrating to me that I felt like, well, what do you do? People would answer with, well, what do you want to do? And it's kind of like trying to drink from a fire hose, right? I was very envious of MDs who would go to get their MD, and then you do your residency, and then you're a pediatrician or a neurologist or whatever. It's a much more defined career path. But with the PhD, there's no shortage of the things that you can do. Once you can break out of that somewhat paralyzing position of feeling like I have so many choices, I don't even know how to start, and you get to recognize that, well, when you identify what you want to do, you can then find that career, because either it exists or you have the potential to do it. And so it was out of that place that I started to thinking about how do we actually distill this down to a framework that allows people to start the process of career transitions. And so we're going to go through this in a little more detail. For me, everything starts with self-awareness and your interests, right? I think this is one of those areas where people don't spend enough time reflecting. Once you have identified what you want to do, then you can start saying, what are the careers that allow me to do those things? Once you have a list of what those careers are, then you can start using this tremendous career tool called informational interviewing. This is one of the most impactful ways to help prepare for making career transitions. Based on that information, you then need to seek out some ways to actually put that into practice, test it out, kick the tires a little bit. Is this really what you thought it was? And then you go back to reflecting, right? Do I still like doing these things? So we're going to go into a little more detail about all of these processes. So we have two quotes to kind of anchor this. And this first one is one that Michelle provided. And so I'm actually going to offer her the opportunity just to say a little bit about, that quote and the person she's quoting. So I sprung that on you, though. You weren't you weren't ready for that one.
I think throughout all of this, I really want to stress that, your own self-realization is the greatest service you can render the world. That's the quote. And what I want to stress is that the self-awareness piece and really figuring out what your unique contribution is so important, and not to necessarily be caught in the sways of, in immigration, if I do this, I'm going to have a better chance of getting an H-1B or a green card. I actually truly think that you finding your unique path and the way that you can contribute is going to help you in all of the things, in finding the career you want and in navigating the immigration system.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. And I think that message is one that I want to reiterate too, right? That a lot of the things we're going to talk about, because a lot of the challenges when you go to navigate your career is you have to communicate why you are the person to do that job, what you bring that other people don't. And so identifying those aspects of your own personality, of your own skill set, of your own passions and motivations, that becomes essential. And so the quote I added in is from Leo Tolstoy. So everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself, right? And so again, this is this idea that it starts with you. And there are things that you can do now, investing in yourself first, that will lead to your ability to put this into practice and change the world later, right? So thinking about careers that you can do, how does that start with you in this process? So again, having that self-awareness and self-reflection throughout your time becomes really important. Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so getting into self-awareness, what does this look like? Really what you're trying to do is figure out, what do you like doing? What do you find most rewarding in your current work? So there are a number of different ways that you can do this. So journaling is a pretty simple way, right? So you keep a lab notebook right now, you're documenting experiments. The purpose of that is to make sure that you know what kinds of reagents you used, what were the experimental conditions, what were the outcomes, so that you can repeat those things later. Well, you can do that same thing about your own interests, right? So keep a career interest lab notebook. Any day that you find really energizing, write down what happened. Did you get to lead the lab meeting? Did you get to analyze some data? What was it in the lab that made it so enjoyable? You can do the same thing for the thing that you don't like doing. Every time you have a day where I'm like, that was horrible, I don't ever want to have to do that again, write that down. Keep track of that information. And then in a couple of weeks or a couple of months, you can look back and start to see patterns emerge, right? And when you find out that every day that's a good day is a day you got to talk about science, and every day that was a bad day was a day that you had to be at the bench, that's giving you information about what you really enjoy doing. So journaling is a really simple way to kind of get in touch with what do you find rewarding in the work that you're doing right now. Another thing to do is to actually employ some personality assessment. So there are a number of ones out there. One of the great ones to start with is the AAAS My IDP. So you may be familiar with this. IDP stands for Individual Development Plan. It's one of those buzzwords and practices that we have now. They can be really helpful, but even before you get to that point, the AAAS website takes you through the skills, interests, and values inventory. And so answering some questions based on what are you good at right now, what are you interested in right now, they'll actually suggest some potential career matches. So you'll see, suggested fits based on your skills, interests, and values. Here are potential careers that would allow you to do those things. there are other things that become really important, like understanding your own unique personality. So it's not just about what you do, but how do you do it that matters. And I keep hearing this again and again, especially when I talk to people who work in industry or recruit for different positions, that they want to know, is this person going to have good emotional intelligence? If they come in and they participate on this team, are they going to be productive or disruptive? Those are things that become really important. So being able to talk about how you do the work that you do is just as important as explaining what it is that you do. One point I always like to make is that we focus a lot, I think in academia, one of the things that happens is we constantly feel like we have to justify that we're qualified to do the job, right? We're always being questioned, we're always being pushed. We're always being criticized for things. And so we get this mindset that, well, I got to demonstrate that I'm qualified to do the job. And we forget that anytime somebody gets interviewed, everybody who's interviewed is qualified to do the job. That's not, otherwise they wouldn't be getting interviewed, right? That's not what's going to separate you. So what are those additional things that you offer that you bring? The StrengthsFinder personality assessment, which is a workshop that we do in the CDO, that's a great way to start getting in touch with your own unique personality talents. And one of the things that's great about StrengthsFinder is once you actually have an idea of your own unique personality and you start looking at different jobs, you can ask questions like, will this job allow me to be my best self? Will this allow me to put into practice the things that I do well? Or is it not going to give me those opportunities? And so it's another piece of data that you can gather as you're trying to evaluate careers. Again, knowing where you're at right now and what you're interested in becomes critical to make those evaluations. So once you have an idea of here's what I like to do, here's the talents that I have, here's the stuff that I find rewarding, now you can start seeking out careers that allow you to do those things. Rather than oftentimes people start off with the, well, I want to look for industry scientist positions. Well, why do you want to look for an industry scientist position? Because you're assuming that it allows you to do those things. When you go back a step though and say, what I really love doing is science communication, you can use science communication as a keyword for job searching rather than a specific title. Right? If it's data analysis, if it is science policy, if it's drug development, all of those things just start off as keywords rather than specific positions. And when you use those keywords, then you'll see a list of the jobs that come up. I think I jumped into that first bullet. I think that's the one we get to. So keyword searches, right? Yes. And so this is where you can really use LinkedIn. You can use Indeed, Monster.com. LinkedIn, I'm going to encourage, is absolutely critical. Having a strong LinkedIn profile and using that tool to build your professional network, to identify careers that are out there. You can set up job alerts and they'll tell you in this specific region, in this field, and then you'll get notifications. It's an easy way to put that platform to work for you. So other things you can do is you can go to career seminars, right? So this happens not infrequently, whether it's put on by the Postdoc Association, the Women in Science Group, or it's at a professional conference that you would attend. Oftentimes there are people who are there speaking about the different careers that they have. That's another easy way to passively consume information and learn about careers that are out there. You can talk to each other, right? And again, I want to stress how important it is having a professional network. And that's not just about having connections to people who are in positions beyond where you're at right now. It's having connections to your peers. Peers are one of the best resources for bouncing ideas off each other, refining how you talk about what you like doing, and identifying other opportunities. All the time, I find situations where postdocs are referring job opportunities to other postdocs, right? So having that strong peer network is important. So figure out, not everybody wants to do what you do. And I think that's one of those other misconceptions in academia is that we all get into science because we love the same things. But that's not true at all. And lots of people have different interests. So keep talking to each other and figure out, well, what is this person thinking about? What is that person thinking about? As a way to get more information. Okay, so now we've got ideas of jobs, right? We have these things in mind. I want to be a medical science liaison. I want to be an industry researcher. Now you need to figure out what is that job really like, because you can get a lot of information from a job posting, but of the 30 things they list as responsibilities, you're not doing each one of them 1/30th of the time, right? They're going to be things that you do predominantly, things that you never really do. Getting advice from people about what do they find rewarding. These are the kinds of things that you really want to get into with informational interviewing. The other thing that happens with informational interviewing is that this is an opportunity to start building your professional network and making these connections to people. And this is an easy way to do it because you're not asking for anything other than for them to talk about themselves. And most people like doing that. It's a flattering thing. You're saying, hey, I think what you're doing is really cool. I'm lost. Help me figure it out, right? Like this is the kind of way that people are willing to start chatting with you about the stuff that they do. And you lay the foundation of building the relationships that become that professional network. However, because of that, you want to make sure that you're prepared before you start these conversations. So you want to know as much as you can about the position, about the company, about that person. If you have areas of connection, you want to do your research ahead of time. You want to have your questions in mind ahead of time so that you're really making best use of the time that they're giving to you. And don't forget, one of the things that's happening here is oftentimes you're looking at research positions. Well, if you go into that informational interview and you haven't done any research about that person, the company, the position, that's not given a very good indication about your abilities as a researcher, right? So this is a way to start setting the understanding of who you are as a professional by showing them how much you've researched to be prepared for those informational interviews. This is what LinkedIn is for, right? So a lot of times people are worried about how do I identify people to interview. Making a cold call produces a lot of anxiety. It's stressful, but this is why we have LinkedIn. This is the whole purpose of LinkedIn's platform. So you shouldn't feel uncomfortable about using LinkedIn to reach out to people to ask for an informational interview. And you don't have to make it weird. You don't have to say, you know, dear Dr. So-and-so, I'd like to do an informational interview. It's, dear Dr. So-and-so, I'm in the process of figuring out where to take my career. I think what you're doing sounds really interesting. Would you be willing to talk with me sometime, right? And sending those personalized messages when you ask to connect, tell them why, so that it's clear to them that you're not trying to sell them something. This is something that happens all the time with me, that frustrates me, that people want to connect on LinkedIn and talk about collaborating, and then it's just selling stuff. So be clear about your intent, right? That you're trying to navigate your career. You'd love to learn more about what it is that they do. But again, this is what LinkedIn is for. So make sure that you are using it to its fullest potential. And alumni, right? Alumni are a great resource. And so finding people who are in your programs, whether this is from your PhD educational program, whether it's from your postdoc, identifying people who have been where you're at that institution becomes a really great way to start learning how to move forward. And again, when you say that, hey, I'm an alumni, or you're an alumni of the program I'm at right now, again, there's that point of connection that makes it more likely that they'll be willing to chat with you. But again, you know, all you're doing with an informational interview is asking somebody for directions. So it's not something that you should be overly worried about doing. And worst case scenario, they just won't answer you, right? They're not going to say, can you believe so-and-so contacted me to, you know, like we tell ourselves a lot of stories oftentimes. Worst thing that's going to happen is somebody's just not going to answer your request. Okay. So now we've gone through this process, right? You've thought about what you like doing. You've identified that. You found jobs that let you do that. You've talked to people that are doing those jobs. Everything sounds great. Kick the tires. Now's when you really need to figure out ways to test this career out and confirm for yourself, right? Because doing something is the best way to figure out whether that's something you actually like doing. It's one thing to hear other people talk about it. It's something else for you to do it yourself. And there's some great tools and ways to do this. One is through online job simulations. There's this website called intersectjobsims.com. They have a number of different sample exercises that can take you through these different fields, consulting, medical writing. So it's a way to kind of check this out and see, here's what the nature of that work is, right? So actually going in and doing some of these artificial exercises can give you a good idea. Yeah, that's actually something that I enjoy doing. Shadowing is another easy way to get more experience with this and to see what that environment is really like. Again, oftentimes when we think about moving into industry positions and industry research, we make assumptions that being an industry scientist is an industry scientist. But if you're that position at a startup, or you're working in that position at Pfizer, those are going to be very different experiences in the nature of the work. So see what that environment is actually like. And now you have all of these people who have been so helpful with informational interviews that you can follow up and say, hey, you know, I've really appreciated the advice and guidance you've given me. I'm trying to learn more about this. Would there be any opportunities for me to follow you around sometime to see what you do? Now, obviously, in the time of COVID, everything is different. In-person stuff is much more difficult, but there still are lots of ways that people can be creative for this. And so I would continue to encourage you to use those connections and try to get some shadowing experience. Better yet is doing an internship, right? Like a formally defined opportunity. And again, this is one of those things Michelle can talk about. Sometimes I know there are visa restrictions on what you can and can't do and what's already defined in the type of visa that you have. But opportunities to do internships or actually test things out. Oftentimes these aren't posted, but they are available. And so contacting somebody at that company who you have built this relationship with the informational interview, and then asking about opportunities is another great way to identify them, because oftentimes there are more opportunities out there than are advertised. And having that strong peer network, having that strong professional network, allows you to tap into a little bit more of that opportunity. And finally, and again, keeping in mind some of the visa restrictions here, but if you can engage in some freelance or contract work, that is the best way to test this stuff out, because here you're actually expected to produce the product, right? So you really get a chance to do this. And careers like medical writing, which is a very popular career now, and is becoming even more accessible because it can be done remotely. That's a great place where there are lots of opportunities to do some freelance contract work before you actually start the position. So again, in that situation, you would be given the proper assignment. You would have an opportunity to really test this out and see, is this something that I really enjoy doing? So at the end of all this, right, now you've gone through this process of self-awareness, identifying positions, talking to people, building that network, testing it out. Now you go back to the beginning, right? Did I really like this? Is this something that I enjoy doing? And oftentimes you're going to go through this process and say, you know, that thing I thought I was interested in, I actually hate it. This was my experience with medical writing. So I always enjoyed writing. I still do enjoy writing. When I was looking at career transitions, I was thinking about potentially moving into that career as an option. And in my mind, it was very romantic, right? I'm going to put on a tweed jacket, leather patches on the elbows, start smoking a pipe. I'm going to be a writer, like all that kind of stuff. And I did it. And I was like, this is really monotonous and boring. And it's easy, but I don't find it stimulating. And I didn't like doing it. And I only figured that out because I tested it out. At the beginning, I thought I was interested in it, right? I went through that process. I got that experience and then reflected again. And so that gets back to those quotes we opened up with, right? It's a continual process of self-reflection. And the other thing that I want to point out is that your interests are going to change over time. What you like doing today, what you like doing 5 years from now, and what you like doing 15 years from now, very unlikely that those are going to be the same things. You're going to grow, you're going to learn more, you're going to get more experience, things are going to change. Be open and receptive to that. And again, if you put this process into practice, you will always be set up for making those career transitions. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it off to Michelle so she can talk specifically about some of the aspects of immigration to consider. Again, keeping this in mind, and we can come back to some more discussion of it in the end.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Okay, so that's a wonderful foundation on career exploration and just some ideas of things that you can and should do to figure out what it is, where you can make your best contributions and where you can be your best self. And so what are some things that the U.S. immigration system values? Well, unique skills are one of those, and we talked about, you know, you want to find that track that is yours and yours alone, and some unique skills that you can develop. The immigration system values outstanding achievement. Well, it's hard to be outstanding if you're doing something that you're not passionate about, that you're not interested in. And I think that, you know, very oftentimes achievement comes with that passion and finding the right place. There's also a value placed on a linear, a straightforward progression through your career. And this is one of the areas that does start to diverge just a little bit. But even as you're doing career exploration throughout, you know, your professional life, you know, you're looking for things that maybe are tangential, still related to what you're doing on the core, but maybe, you know, you have a job where you're doing 10% of something that you really, really enjoy. How can you find ways to make that 25? How can you get that? So there's ways to incorporate these things even going after what you really want. And then a clear and compelling narrative. So you want to understand yourself, you want to understand where you've been, you want to have a clear picture of where you're going. Those kinds of things are really, really helpful as you navigate the immigration environment. Okay, so what does this employment-based immigration kind of look like? So in 2019, and we all realized that in the time of COVID, these numbers, especially some of these international student numbers, they're changing. But in 2019, this is still can be illustrative. There were over 1 million international students enrolled in the United States. And of that number, about a quarter of them ended up participating in optional practical training. So this is something that F1 students can use to get those experiences and test some things out, whether it be you working for an employer, this is where some of those contract type of opportunities, internships might come in. Okay, so we had about 250,000 individuals who are in optional practical training. Now the funnel starts to narrow because there are only 85,000 H-1Bs available to cap subject employers. However, universities, research facilities, they are not subject to those same caps. And, again, this is one of those places where what's good in the immigration context maybe starts to diverge, or you really need to start thinking about what it is that you really want, because the truth is that it could indeed be easier to find a position in academia or at a research facility maybe than it is to find something in industry, but there still are 85,000 H-1Bs available in industry, and there are a lot of academic institutions that have a lot of partnerships with industry. There are niches within academia that you can find that might be more suited to you and what it is that you want. Okay, then we start to narrow further. At this point in time, there are 140,000 employment-based green cards issued. So that's not a whole lot when you look at what's happening earlier. And there are caps in place by country. So that's the current situation. There's continuously talk about changing that, but so far, this is where we are, and so this is what you need to be prepared for. Okay. I know that there are graduate students here on the call with us. I know that there are research scholars as well who are likely on J's. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about those different categories. I wanted to start with the H-1B category because this is where you really need to start focusing in. This is where that funnel starts to really tighten. And in the H-1B context, you really need to be cognizant that what the government is looking for and what employees are going to be looking for is whether that position is a specialty occupation. And new rulings have just come down that tighten this even a little bit further. And the most important thing to keep in mind here is that to the best of your ability, you want what you studied to translate into the job that you're doing. Sometimes where this is where that compelling narrative and your ability to tell your story really come in, because there isn't maybe always a super crystal clear equivalency or a translation, but to the best of your ability, the closer you can align what it is that you're studying with what it is that you're doing and what the requirements are, the easier and the better off you're going to be when you get to the H-1B context. and then from the H-1B context, the next goal is really to obtain employment-based permanent residency. And I share this chart with you. I apologize, and I'm sure, as you realize, immigration is quite complex. There's a lot of concepts to keep in mind. The real purpose of this chart is to illustrate two things. There are several pathways. There is not just one single pathway, and to differentiate a bit between what I would call merit-based petitions, where you have to show that you're outstanding or extraordinary, and the labor certification process, where again you're going to need to show that you are uniquely qualified, and that there are not either that you're the most qualified candidate of all the others. This is if you're in academia, primarily, or that you have unique skills and abilities that a U.S. worker that's a permanent resident or a citizen doesn't have, cannot bring to the employer. Okay, so again, especially in that merit-based context, you're going to be competing against others in your field of study or your area of endeavor. And so as you think about this, it's important to strike the balance between a very broad field of study. Let's compare biology, and now we're narrowing it down. Biochemistry, molecular biology, molecular genetics. And, there is a balance there, but often the more focused you can be, the better the chance that you are going to be of being found to be outstanding, or your work being in the national interest, because you're able to offer something that is unique. And here consider also multidisciplinary studies, translational research. Those things, of course, have great value, and that is another place where that narrative becomes important. How do all the things that I've done to get to this place in my career really contribute to what I'm able to do in the research space or for this employer? You know what? I will take the opportunity to answer one of the questions that was submitted in advance, and the question was, how do I know when my credentials are strong enough to really start this process? And I think it depends. It depends on the path that you're going to choose, and it depends on your specific field of study, because again, you're competing against other people that are going to have, probably similar publication records, similar citation records, and so there's quite a substantial difference for someone who is in molecular biology compared to someone maybe who's in business analytics. And so what a strong background looks like in those two areas are very, very different. And so in the science backgrounds, and the especially medical science kinds of areas, research areas, one piece of guidance, but it is just guidance, it's not true every single time, but you would want to have around 10 publications and around 100 citations to really start thinking about an employment-based first preference. Let's go back to that in maybe that extraordinary ability or the outstanding professor research area. On the other hand, an employment-based second preference national interest waiver, that can look quite a bit different. Maybe your publication record isn't quite as strong, but you've written a really compelling paper on a novel concept, and it's getting a lot of attention. and you have plans, you've got support to take that in, much further. That could look much, much different, what those credential requirements could be. And in the labor certification context, really what we're looking at is, what does the job require? What are the credentials that you have? And is there a close match for that? And I can tell you that employers often end up, really thinking carefully about the requirements of a specific position, and maybe not necessarily tailoring it to the person that they want to sponsor for permanent residency, but thinking very carefully about what it is that you are bringing to the table and the unique skills and qualifications and experiences that you can offer. So let's go on to what's going on in the current immigration environment. I hesitate because it's a tough topic, but we'll talk about it anyway. So under the current administration, although I really want to acknowledge that, things have been challenging in the immigration world for quite a long time. All of the things that are challenges for us are not exclusively things that have come about in the current administration. However, the immigration policies that we've seen really are working to create an invisible wall and further barriers that make it. They raise the level of uncertainty. They raise the barriers. They just make it more challenging, both for employers and institutions, and for people who are interested in making a life and making a career in the United States. One of these kind of overarching policies has been the Buy American, Hire American. And again, this is where that greater tightening, if you will, of the specialty occupation definition comes in. That was really in reaction to this Buy American, Hire American edict. Stricter standards, greater scrutiny, more RFEs, more denials, just a little bit harder. Right now, we're also seeing a situation where USCIS funding, it has been allocated for more enforcement and not as much to the adjudication, the customer service area, which it was previously. And so that's causing some delays, some backlogs in the kinds of applications and petitions that you all file and that we file on your behalf, and that employers would be filing. There's also a visa backlog situation because no one has addressed the demand that was there for especially in the permanent residency. That's really what this is referring to. However, in October of this year, right now, we saw significant movement, especially in the first base categories for folks from China and India. So it's not all gloom and doom. That was one definite silver lining. I know that there are many of you probably have colleagues across the institution who are getting their applications to adjust ready, and so that's great. I wanted to go into this just a little bit more and really start to explain that all three branches of the federal government are involved in the immigration process. So there's the legislative aspect. Congress could at any time, should they choose to prioritize it, come out with new immigration laws and regulations that would definitely impact what it is that we do. What we're seeing right now, though, is most of what's coming out is coming from the executive branch, so the president, as well as all of the administrative agencies like Department of Homeland Security and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, Customs and Border Protection, and the U.S. State Department. These are all agencies that are under the executive branch, Department of Justice. And then the judiciary, the courts are also getting involved in the immigration picture right now. And I'll give you some examples of some things that we're seeing. Okay, so we've got some presidential proclamations, that you've likely been paying attention to so they come out with these proclamations, suspending entry of immigrants who present a risk, blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, what this does, it creates all of this fervor and excitement and anxiety amongst all of us who are really trying to keep a close track on this, all of you who are seeing this out in the media. But then when you take a further look at it, there's a lot of exclusions, there's a lot of exceptions. It's actually really only impacting a fairly narrow subset of people. Now, I acknowledge that for the people that it does impact, this is a big deal. This is not easy. And it's again, one of those very, very challenging things. But I would urge you, as you see these things come out in the media, really, really look for, well, what's the exception? Who is really, really impacted by this? Does this really affect me? And I think that you will find that in many instances, it doesn't affect you, or maybe it doesn't impact you in quite the way that you think it will. And so please, ISSS keeps an update section on its website. Please feel free to reach out, and do reach out to your immigration, your advising staff to help you understand what's really going on and how these things are going to impact you specifically. There are a lot of national interest exceptions to these kinds of things. And that means like anybody who's involved in COVID research, anyone who is previously working here, those people are going to fall under these exceptions. Okay, but, the agencies are taking action to respond to these orders that are asking them to request. So this slide really just, again, talks about the specialty occupation, and we already talked about that. We had already seen a narrowing in how USCIS adjudicated, that just is a fancy word for decided H-1B cases, and we, in the way that we work, we've already been addressing this. I think you're going to find that a lot of the employers that you're working with in council, they've already adjusted their practices to really account for some of these things that are now being codified, that are now actually showing up in the regulations. I do want to talk about the Department of Justice China initiative. We've seen greater activity on the part of not only the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigations is part of that, and they're really just taking a much closer look at activities and activities that are going on college campuses, and the community has been getting together to to think about policies that we can put in place, practices that we can put in place to help protect all of us. But I want to share with you that the group that is talking about this, a very primary value of institutional leadership is academic freedom, the research that folks are involved in, and making sure that people can still be productive and have access to the information that they need. At the same time that we want to put in place, as I said, policies that protect all of us. The judicial branch. Here is just a quick rundown of what happens and how the judiciary is involved. So this is the example that I'm using here is the public charge rule. So it was set to go into effect. It was all ready to go into effect back about a year ago. And then shortly before, there were lawsuits filed and courts came out and they said, wait, not so fast. We're not going to allow you to put this rule into place. So everybody stopped, everybody recalibrated. That rule did not go into to effect, that we had to go back and figure out, okay, which forms are we using? What's actually going on here? And then you see this. It went all the way up through the courts. This is how this works. Starts off at a lower court, percolates up through the various levels of federal court, finally ends up in the Supreme Court. They said, no, you know what, we're not gonna, all of the enjoining that's going on, we think this is fine, go ahead. Well, then the U.S. District Court for the Southern District went back, and this is in the time of COVID again, and said, wait, there's more. We don't think that you should be able to put this into place now when all of this is going on with COVID. We're in a state of emergency. We don't want you to put this into effect. The injunction, it was national, then it was narrowed, and then now the Court of Appeal has said, no, injunction is over. Department of Homeland Security, USCIS, you all go ahead and implement this rule. So they're going to do that, and now we're waiting for guidance and all of these things to come out. As a practical matter for all of you, it means that you have to, answer a lot of questions about any government benefits that you may have received and whether or not, your salaries are enough to be here. So mostly for this audience that I'm speaking to today, this is an annoyance. And it raises the uncertainty because, all of this stuff is going on, and it creates havoc for, ISSS and for immigration attorneys who are trying to keep track of all of this stuff and trying to give you the best and most up-to-date possible in an environment where things are changing daily. Things are changing daily at this point. And so this is just illustrative of how this happens. And this happens with most of the things that come out. An order comes out, someone files a lawsuit, there's maybe an injunction on all or part of the rule, it works its way up, eventually the rule or some version of the rule is implemented, but in the meantime, it's chaos. Okay, and in the meantime, Congress, who, like we talked about, has the authority to introduce legislation to really address all of these things, has not been able to do anything. We've made some bills have been introduced, legislation has been looked at, but ultimately it's just not going through right now. And I know that in folks that I've talked to in various congressional offices, they've said, look, with all of this going on, with the healthcare situation, with the economy and what's happening with that, it could be a really heavy lift for anything related to immigration to get off the ground. So there's that. What do you need to know? What can you do? So learn as much as possible about the U.S. immigration system. I don't think, to the extent that you can, and that to the extent that you can stay calm, relatively calm while doing so, and it doesn't contribute to your anxiety, track some of the things that are going on, maybe most importantly, really just to keep track of how it's going to affect you and your current situation. I don't know that you need to keep track of everything that happens, every court case with like the public charge rule, for example. But you are gonna want to get good advice and go to someone that you can trust and that is keeping up with all of these things. When you are involved in a process, you do want to really understand what are the eligibility requirements, how much time is this going to take, how are quotas and backlogs going to affect me, how much is it going to cost. You are always going to want to keep extremely careful records of your credentials, your immigration status, all of your accomplishments, so that you can refer back to that when the time comes. You want to look at your unique situation and your unique options. I would encourage you to consult with a licensed attorney on that, someone who knows you and can look at your best interests. And do understand that everyone's situation is unique, and even small details can have big consequences. Bruce talked about talking to your peers. Absolutely. But don't necessarily go to them for immigration advice. You want to go to someone who can assess your unique situation and really understand how what you need to do and what is best for you. I'm going to say this, given the current immigration situation, it could be worth your time to look at, what your situation would look like somewhere else. What would this look like in Canada? What would this look like in Europe or Australia? Just so you know, and just so that you have a point of comparison. Bruce, do you want to, anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, I think that this is, we can get at some of this in the discussion in the end, but I think a lot of these things that become important for documenting your accomplishments for immigration purposes become important for demonstrating your competitiveness for any position. And so this is a good practice to get into. And I think that a lot of those same things that will help you prepare for your career are exactly the same kind of things that go into putting together these compelling portfolios and narratives about what it is that you've done. So, we can talk a little bit more about some of those things as we get into the discussion. But there was one question here, Michelle, about do you know if EB-2s are being processed right now?
Are EB-2s being processed right now? Everything is going through. Nothing has changed. Yes, if you are in progress, there's nothing out there that would prevent you from proceeding with any part of the process. Might it be a little bit more challenging than it would have been 4 years ago? Yeah, probably, maybe, but EB-2s, H-1Bs, all of these things are still being processed. Do be aware of the significant time and resources that employer might need to devote. We, as an employer, we've started using outside counsel extensively, pretty much for all of our employment-based immigration proceedings, because things are volatile, because things are changing so quickly, and because things do need to be done correctly and to a certain level of exactitude. That's worked out quite well for us. And as the previous person discussed, we're still moving forward with all of things we would have done previously. Okay, you also, you want to make sure that you can talk about convincingly and articulately your value to the employer. Not just your skills and degrees, some of those soft skills that Bruce was talking about before, the how you do your job and how you're going to fit into the team and be a productive member. You want to talk about your long-term career plan and how the things that went before are going to lead you to that next, that next level, that next stage. And you're going to want to let them know why the additional time and resources that they're going to invest in you, why is that worth it? What's the return on investment for the employer?
Michelle, if I can jump in right here, I would say that I think that, a lot of this, and again, this isn't true. This is true for everyone, regardless of whether if this is part of your process of changing visa status as well. But the earlier you start building these relationships, if you have that relationship with an employer before you're applying for the job, so you've met this person at networking events or at conferences, or you're demonstrating your value in different ways, they're already invested in you. And so it becomes much easier for them to say, oh yeah, here's why we want to make sure that we hire this person. Here's how we can help make that happen, right? That becomes easier when you have those pre-established relationships. So starting the networking process early and throughout becomes so important for that. And this other thing that I think is important to remember, and we don't talk about enough, it's not always recognized or seen in these terms, but there's this guy, Scott Page, who's a professor at the University of Michigan. He's a professor of economics and mathematics, but he talks about the diversity bonus. And so there's a lot of value that you bring with having perspectives that might represent growing up in a different country and seeing things differently. And that's a lot of value that you can bring to an organization. And so getting in touch with those kinds of things and helping people understand that to really be innovative, to solve complex problems in the knowledge economy, diversity is a strength. That's how people actually move things forward. And so, that is something that's a selling point that you can offer as well. The quick story about, there's a former postdoc who took a position as an industry scientist at one of the startups across the street at Anschutz. And part of the reason that she was so competitive was because she was able to work with clients in China because she was from China. And so she had this understanding, she had this ability, and that was something that they wanted. That was part of what they had needed, right? And so again, the sooner you start talking to people and building that network and identifying these opportunities, the smoother these transitions can become when you're ready to make them.
Excellent point. Thank you so much for that. I think sometimes I forget to talk about that because it just seems so obvious to me, but it's an excellent point.
There's one more question came in here. Is the OPT application process being affected by these challenges too?
I think it's fair to say that it is. The differences are a bit more subtle, but we're starting to see some of that specialty occupation relationship requirement creep into optional practical training and what USCIS is really looking for there. So again, they're looking for that very close relationship between what it is that you studied and what it is the position that you're going to be doing while you're doing your optional practical training. And so, if you studied biochemistry and you're going to a position that clearly requires a biochemistry background, great. Not a problem in any way, shape, or form. And, folks who are doing master's degrees, PhD degrees, sometimes it's easier to draw that nexus, make that argument that there is a very clear relationship, where people who are going to have a challenge right now are folks maybe like MBAs, for example, and you're studying this wide variety of topics, and you might have to work just a little bit harder to show that, look, the 3 marketing courses that I took, it combined with the accounting classes and what I know about, other business-related concepts, they really are required by the employer, and they really do come into play as I'm doing this job. So I think that's the most important change that we've seen. So, what does all of this mean? What does all of this mean? Yes. You want to be thinking right now about a long-term career plan, to the best of your ability. How does what you're doing today, how is that going to get you where you want to go? What are your professional objectives, and how how are those utilizing your unique strengths and your unique skills and interests? Get your educational goals. Does what you want to do, is it going to require an advanced degree? And in what? What does that look like? The employment prospects, and I'm going to ask Bruce to chime in on this because I know he's got some comments about this.
About employment prospects? So, yeah. So I think, again, a lot of this comes down to what are the kinds of things that you're interested in. But then once you have that in mind, that's really when you need to get that insider perspective about where are those opportunities. I think within academic sectors, because of the financial constraints that COVID has placed, it's going to be a difficult process there. There are more opportunities, though, for postdocs. I think there are more opportunities for non-tenure track type positions. So there could be additional advantages. When you look at the private sector and scientist positions, again, that's going to depend on the flavor of your science. I mean, if you're a virologist right now, you're a hot commodity, right? So again, I think a lot of that is just going to depend on the specific sector in which you're trying to find some of that employment. And again, I think one of the things that comes up in the next slides here is thinking about, especially when you're thinking about those long-term plans. Michelle put together a list of questions that we're going to encourage everybody to think about. But one of those is setting those goals. I mean, maybe one of your goals is to continue to have job opportunities in the United States. And that might mean something throughout the course of the immigration process until you have the point of having that resident status. And after that, that's the point when you differentiate into the kinds of things you want. And so it's more important right now that that's your primary goal. And so getting the demonstrated progression of career opportunities that will help with that, that's where you put that priority. So again, the long-term professional objectives, those can be very multifaceted. We run into this all the time when people come to Colorado and they love Colorado and they don't want to leave Colorado. And so that's going to change what kinds of positions you consider, especially when you're thinking about faculty positions. It's a rarity that you get to call your shot for that. You go where the job is, right? And that may mean you're working in South Dakota. And so I don't have anything against South Dakota.
Hey, yeah, I'm from South Dakota. No, I take your point.
So again, being flexible in that way. And again, thinking really about those goals for that. I should have said Minnesota because we can both agree that we don't like Minnesota, right? Although you went to St. Cloud State, right?
Mankato. Yeah, so you're going to have to, think about that. But that's exactly right. And, maybe a more stark example would be, now is not necessarily the time to do something that's related to coal extraction. Maybe now is the time to look towards green energy. It just really all depends. But when you look at employment prospects, all of those were good points. What's the trajectory of what's going on? Are those opportunities in the place where you want to be? Along with the immigration pieces and what that might mean. It might mean foregoing, doing something now because you need to get that green card, delaying that. And this brings up a really important point. With the visa backlog situation, I know that we have had folks who have been waiting to get that green card for years and years and years. And so I'd say that just to say you want to have a place, a waypoint on your path, at some point where you stop and you say, is this still what I want? Is what I'm doing right now, are the maybe the sacrifices that you're making to get to where you want, are they still worth it? And is it time to maybe stop and reassess, to go back and do some additional career exploration and find out if there's maybe another pathway that is better for you at this point? And right now, with everything that's happening, how long some of these processes take, kind of setting out in your mind, all right, we're going to pursue this for 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, I'm going to stop. I'm going to take another look at where we're going and just check in, and make sure that this still makes sense for me. Here again, this is just a little more expansion on the demonstrating your involvement and value, really setting how you are going to be worth it to that employer. And, things like not just documenting your professional achievements and all the and the papers and the awards and all of those kinds of things, but documenting your activities. And I know that we were going to talk about some possible activities, one of them being the I-score. This is an opportunity to mentor a student who is interested in science, or to be mentored by someone who has that experience and can provide those perspectives. And so, Bruce, I don't know if you want to tuck in and maybe jump in and talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, so I think this first point about, again, what are those additional things that you bring? This is true from any application standpoint. It's great to have a technical skill set. It's great to have that knowledge base, but what are those additional things that you've done? And so demonstrating that you have this professional growth, you participated in workshops. As Michelle was just mentioning, this International Scholar Opportunity for Research Exchange, or I-Scores, this program we've run for a number of years. Dr. Cristina Cenciarelli is the one who runs that, and we can put you in touch with her. After that, we'll send out some materials. But this is a program that pairs up undergraduate students interested in research with international scholars who are interested in mentorship. And it's an opportunity to exchange cultures, ideas, practice language in low-stakes situations. Lots of really great things that come out of it. And participation in that program is a great way to demonstrate some mentorship. And getting a letter talking about your involvement in that. I've written letters for international scholars summarizing the workshops that they've participated in, because again, it's demonstrating a commitment to that professional development and growth. Your participation with the Postdoc Association or the Association of International Researchers, building programs, doing more things, those all have value. So don't overlook them when you're thinking about putting together your portfolio, and keep a record for it, because again, this is continued evidence of all of the ways in which you have contributed to the scientific atmosphere and environment for things.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't be afraid to ask for letters of recommendation. You're moving on maybe from your PhD to a postdoc position, but you've got your dissertation advisor. If things have gone well and you think they would provide a strong letter, ask for it. Don't be shy. So, these opportunities often come up at those inflection points, those points of transition. Both Bruce and I have written letters for people in all kinds of ways, and I've definitely had letters written for me. It's a thing that's done. You should do it too. And ask that your contributions be formally recognized. Were you an author? Maybe you weren't the first author, but maybe that paper couldn't have been written without you. Chances are that PI is going to be willing to write a letter that says that. Where your key personnel, any media mentions, you get those formal recommendations. It builds the record. Those kinds of things are essential in some of these immigration processes as well. And then, the point that it's never too early. You want to start doing this at the undergraduate stage, certainly during your PhD program. But if you haven't done so already, do think about going back and just getting all of the documentation that you can now to build that record. All right, so this is the list of all of the things that we thought it's really important for you to think about. What's more important to you? What do you really want? What is your priority? Is it most important to you that you be able to stay in the US and you want to do that in the long term? Okay, well that's gonna guide some decisions. It's gonna lead to a certain course of action. Or is it more important to you to work in a specific career? And maybe that involves taking a look at, other locations where that might be more possible and that you can do that a little bit earlier. Again, thinking very carefully, what unique skills and abilities do I have that set me apart? That's where that exploration, that self-awareness really comes in. What are you going to continue to do to continue to build on that unique skill set and keep it up to date? If you're someone who does bioinformatics, how are you going to make sure that you are exposed to and learning, the new programs and the new tools that are coming out continuously? How do you identify an employer who's going to be supportive of your immigration situation? Yeah, well, that's where, again, establishing that network and people who know you and know the path that you've been on and understand your true value, that can really come into play in that, identifying that employer who's going to be willing to go the distance with you. If you do want to stay in the U.S., what does your long-term plan look like? Are you familiar with the eligibility requirements and the different pathways? Do you understand what the timelines could really look like and really what's reasonable? And have you built that into your plan? How do you keep options available to you? And this is something that really depends on your unique situation, but it's a conversation that I would encourage you to have with your supervisors, with your mentors, with your peers. And then, again, I touched on this already, but the timelines and these things kind of shift around. But just having that general idea in your head about what the timeline is going to look like. What's your backup plan? If an if an executive order comes down that actually does affect you, and now the things that you've worked for and dreamed of maybe are going to need to look different, are you prepared for that? Are you prepared for some of those contingencies? And then questions that you have for us, and we've got a few that came in previously, but we'll look back to the chat and see. I don't see anything else coming through.
Yeah, I think we got all the ones from the chat. We can go through some of these questions that people shared when they registered. But then as you have questions, please share those so we can address them now. I also just posted into the chat a link to a brief evaluation for today's session. Again, we had done this one time before. This is the first time doing it virtually, so we really would appreciate knowing kind of what worked, what didn't work, things that we can do to continue offering this in the future. So if you would even just open that link now, you don't have to fill it out, but just so that you have it in your browser when we do close this down. I'll send it out when we send out the follow-up email with a link to the recording, some information about iScore, and some of those other opportunities we would have. But just so you know that that's there, we really would value your feedback on today's session. Otherwise, we can just kind of go through some of the questions that people posted when they registered. Michelle, do you have that in front of you, or do you want me to read them off and then?
Maybe it would be good just for people who may be watching the recording later, if you wouldn't mind reading them, and I'll respond.
Sure. So I'll try to go through and hit some of the ones that I think maybe we didn't necessarily cover in the session. So one of the questions was, is there an optimal time frame to apply for a green card during the H-1B transition?
And the answer to that is, I think that there is. And so here's some things to keep in mind. Everyone has 6 years of eligibility in H-1B status. And in addition, you're able to recapture any time that you spent outside of the United States while you were in H-1B status. But essentially, you've got 6 years of eligibility that you can work with. And so I think that the optimal time to begin applying for the green card is no later than really when you're applying for that. You can apply in 3-year terms. periods of time. When you're applying for that second 3-year period, that extension, you've used 3 years, you still have 3 remaining. That's really the ideal time, I believe, to get started with the green card process. In talking to practitioners, the guidance that we used to follow is you want to make sure that you've applied for the first step of the green card while you still have 365 days of H-1B status remaining. With all the uncertainty and the different proclamations and changes in rules and things like that, we're all pushing that forward a bit. And so that I hope that that's helpful. You do need to apply while you still have 365 days available in order to continue to be eligible for H-1B extensions while your green card is pending. You know, and one of the facts of life about this is that all of these processes can and are taking a little bit more time than they were before. So the earlier, the better. Another factor to consider is, am I with an employer right now who's in a position to sponsor me? Does that make sense? Is the value proposition there? You know, you don't necessarily want to ask an employer to sponsor you if your intention is to move on. That's not a good strategy, because I also want you to understand that once you start the labor certification process, you're kind of stuck with that employer for the duration. There's some additional rules, there's some caveats to that, but you want to apply with an employer where you have a mutually beneficial situation going on and you intend to stick with that employer. So I hope that that's helpful and responsive.
There's a question that came in the chat here about how to get reference letters from professors that cited your publications when applying for NIW. I'll admit I don't know what NIW stands for.
I think I do. So I'm going to say in this context, it applies for national interest waiver. What it is, it's in a merit-based option that requires a substantial record of achievements and credentials, one of them being these types of expert letters that you would get from, you know, from people who are in your field who may have identified your work. We actually have a template letter that we use, but essentially the kinds of information you want to share with that person are, you know, what have you achieved? A summary of your achievements, your professional achievements. You know, maybe some indication of what the relationship is there. So here you're saying, hey, you know, I noticed that you cited my work. You know, thank you for that confidence. I'm wondering if, because you found my work beneficial, if you would be willing to, you know, write a letter. And so here's some additional details that you might consider including in that letter. But again, using that template, including those kinds of details, professors get these kinds of requests all the time, so don't be shy. There's nothing stopping you, and you should know that they are used to writing these kinds of letters. What you want to do is make it easy for them and make it compelling for them to respond to your request.
That's great, and I think the only thing I wanted to add to that is that again, being forward thinking about knowing these are the kinds of things you're gonna want to have, and building and maintaining those relationships early on. So this is one of those areas where professional social media becomes really important. So again, there may be specific people that you have already identified for other purposes, and so there should be some relationship there. But if you follow them on something like ResearchGate or LinkedIn, where they're sharing publications or asking scientific questions, you can maintain those relationships in that virtual environment. So when you do make these requests, you're also somebody who has continued to be present in their mind. And again, this just highlights the importance of having that strong network, because when you have a network, which really is just relationship building, right? So when you have professional relationships with people, an ask like this later on isn't a big ask, because they know you and you know them. And so all of that stuff becomes a little bit easier. Okay, another question about actually, would it affect my chance of applying for a green card if I start a company during my OPT while still working in the lab at Anschutz?
You know, these kinds of questions, you really want to be do a risk evaluation of those kinds of activities, and you want to make sure that you're talking to somebody who can, you know, help you assess, okay, do I have the authority? Am I authorized? Does the immigration status that I have now, does it permit me to engage in these kind of activities? And I have to tell you, there's so much gray area in these things. And so I would suggest when you're looking at opportunities outside, you know, kind of the traditional things that are allowed with optional practical training, you probably want to talk to an immigration attorney who has some experience with, and what they are likely going to say is, well, maybe not. Let's really think about what the risk is here. You know, maybe it's to the benefit, where you've shown that you're entrepreneurial, you've succeeded, you've done something on your own. I mean, that is quite an achievement. On the other hand, you don't want to be in a situation where you're doing your adjustment of status and USCIS looks back and says, wait a second, were you authorized for this employment? What's going on here? And now all of a sudden you need a waiver, or they say that you're not eligible for that green card. So these are the kinds of things that you really do need to be cognizant of, and where that true expert advice from an immigration attorney who can look at you and your unique situation is invaluable.
So another question, if working in an interdisciplinary field, how to identify which field will bring more edges when applying the green card? And so I think before even you jump in on that one, I'm going to say that my guess is it's probably whichever one shows how uniquely qualified your skill set is. So the piece about distinguishing yourself in the field as the person who can do this thing, if you have to choose, which is the one in which you will be seen as being more uniquely qualified to do it than the other field. If there are, 500 molecular biologists, but only one person that does the tissue engineering, that's the area that probably would be the one that would be a little bit better. But Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, that, and can you create a compelling narrative that really kind of ties all of the pieces of your background together and shows that, you know what, look, because I have a background in zoology and experiment design and cancer research, I am now uniquely qualified to be the person who does what I do, that combines, all of those aspects of my background and experience and my skills. And very often that's possible. Multidisciplinary, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to choose one aspect, although the advice that Bruce gave, that if you do, you're going to choose the one where you are strongest. But oftentimes you can say, you know what, I'm actually in this emerging field called, whatever it is, experimental design and cancer research. And, look at this awesome paper that I published that really shows my unique contribution to this area. So I think it's about really thinking carefully about your background experience, how what you're doing now, or what the job that's going to be the basis of that petition, how you arrive there, and how the pieces all fit together, and creating that compelling narrative.
Okay, we have Michelle. I think we have time for one last question. There are two here. Maybe we can sneak them both in. One is just how many reference letters do people usually get when submitting a green card application? The other is a specific question about how to get a postdoc in psychology focused on research with an international PhD in an area. I think that one's a little more specific. I'll respond to that one in the chat. But if you want to take a crack at both of those, that would be great too.
Okay, I'm gonna let the postdoc, I'll let you respond to that. I don't think I have anything meaningful to say. How many reference letters? Again, it depends. And you're going to want to balance, people who know you well against people who truly are independent. And maybe that's where that person who cited your paper, but is going to be able to look at you independently. They don't necessarily know you personally. There's going to be that balance. There's a balance between the letters that you have from within the United States and who you are able to get from the international arena. 10 letters is not necessarily better than 5 if the 5 letters that you do have are really good letters. And so I think with that question, you're going to want to work with the person who's advising you, and see how that plays out in your situation. However, probably somewhere in the range of 6-ish, let's just say. That's what you should be thinking about. And I will say that in order to get those 6 letters, you may have to ask for many more. You might have to request, 10 letters to get those 6 really solid letters. Yeah, thank you for your time and attention and for your great questions. The tough part with these kinds of things is they often raise more questions than they answer. But that's good. That's okay. We're happy that this has got you thinking and got you really delving in to, your circumstances and the information that you need to make the most of your circumstances. So we hope that this was helpful, and we look forward to interacting with you, and we most definitely look forward to your comments and your assessment of what works for you and what didn't in this talk today.
Yeah, so thank you. I just echo what Michelle said. Thank you all for coming today, and thank you, Michelle, for hosting with me. I think this is a really valuable resource, and I'm very happy for this partnership. So if you have any questions going forward, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and best of luck as you navigate your careers going forward.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you to the participants.
Bye, everybody.